Welcome to Energy Unplugged, the go-to podcast focusing on the global energy transition. My name is Ana Barillas, and I'm Aurora's Managing Director for Iberia and Latin America. Today, we have a very special guest joining us to talk about Chile's energy sector and its remarkable journey in renewable energy integration. I'm delighted to welcome Francisco Muñoz, Director of Research at Generadoras de Chile, the trade association representing Chile's power generation companies. Francisco, welcome.
Thanks, Anna, for the invitation.
So just to give you a little bit of background to our listeners about you, Francisco studied mechanical engineering at Universidad de Chile and then went on to do a Ph.D. in energy economics and operations research at Johns Hopkins University. He worked in the US at Sandia National Laboratories in Albuquerque, New Mexico, before returning to Chile. So, Francisco, I'm really interested, given your extensive background and focus on electricity markets, both in the US and Chile, to know what you think are kind of some of the biggest differences between the way people think about power markets in the US and the way people think about power markets in Chile. We'll talk about the actual differences, but kind of the approach to thinking about it and kind of market design regulation is something that I find really interesting. So, what's that in your experience?
Yeah. So let's start with the things that are similar. As of today, I'll say that the market design in Chile is a simplified version of a restructured US electricity market. And the reason I say this is because Chile has a centralized market with an independent system operator known as El Coordinador. We use nodal pricing or an approximation of that. We have ancillary services. There's also a capacity mechanism. But unlike the US, in Chile, all generation assets are owned by independent power producers, IPPs, and there are no vertically integrated utilities adding generation capacity as part of an integrated resource plan. So all generation investments in Chile are a response to market incentives, basically.
Okay, no, that's fascinating, and I've also found that super interesting in having kind of various conversations with Chilean market participants. There is just such a big focus on kind of data and modeling, probably more than I have ever seen in the 20 years I've spent kind of doing this. And I have worked in the US and in Europe as well. And I think it relates to first data availability. Data availability is just absolutely fantastic. You can get all the data you could ever want to model the power system in Chile. And then I think it's just a deeper level of understanding of the market from kind of the broader population. So, people understand how the market works. If you're in the energy sector, you understand how the market works. I think probably at a deeper level than in other countries. That's my impression. I don't know whether you share that impression or not. Feel free to disagree.
No. Yeah. First, Chile is a small country. There are only a handful of universities where people get trained in these things. Yeah, and as you say, access to data is much better today than what it used to be. And you're right. There's a huge focus in Chile on the modeling because, as you know, we have a cost-based market. There's a central estimate of the opportunity cost of water. That means that there's a lot of modeling involved in just running the market. And I think that's not the case for other electricity markets in the rest of the world.
Fantastic. So, you touched a little bit on, Chile is a cost-based kind of market, but there's a lot to discuss around, how Chile is structured. So let's get into that. So, I think one of the most fascinating things for me, for those that may not know, is that Chile was the first country in the world to liberalize its power markets back in 1982, and I find this fascinating because it's always been kind of a leader in the energy space, and so. For those people that may not know the Chilean market, it'd be great, Francisco, if you can give a little bit of an overview of, how the market that led liberalization is now looking, kind of what are some of the key kind of characteristics and metrics of the Chilean power system now?
Sure. Yeah. So let's start with resources first. So as of today, Chile has 35 gigawatts of installed generation capacity, and we're going to use the US uh, to compare ourselves
Mhm.
with. So resource-wise, I believe that 35 gigawatts of capacity places us between the size of ISO New England and New York ISO. About two-thirds of that capacity comes from renewables like hydro, solar, wind. The remaining third is from non-renewable resources such as coal, gas, and diesel. Um, Chile has a summer peaking electricity demand. The peak load is 12 gigawatts over the summer. That's in February. And an annual demand of about 85 terawatt hours. In terms of our transmission system, as you would expect it, it's long and narrow, just like the shape of the country. Um, the system operator manages almost 40,000 kilometers of high voltage lines. Uh, I think that's similar in scale to the California ISO.
Okay.
Um, we have only one 200 megawatt transmission interconnection with Argentina. And what you just described, right? Chile is known for its pioneering role in electricity regulation. 4 decades ago, Chile was the first country to reform the power sector, introducing competition in generation and unbundling generation, transmission, and distribution.
Fantastic. And one of the things, and as in your role, you have much more up-to-date data on this, so
Mhm.
feel free to correct me. But I believe renewables account now for about 45% of electricity generation in Chile. Is that
In,
consistent with your figures,
um, in 2023, 64% of all electricity came from renewables, including
including
solar,
hydro?
wind, and hydro. Yes.
Okay, so it's 64% of
Mhm.
electricity generated in Chile comes from renewables. And how much of that do you know was added in the last 5 years or so?
We normally talk about the last decade. So if
Okay.
you want to, have a broader perspective. So in 2013, Chile had around 6 gigawatts of renewables, and 95% of that was hydro. And in 2024, that number jumped to 21 gigawatts, and 65% of that capacity is solar now and wind, and the rest is hydro. And the result is what you just mentioned. In 2023, nearly 64% of all electricity came from renewables, and that's twice the share of renewables we saw in 2013. And in fact, according to Ember, Chile is now the first country to reach 20% of solar PV share in its electricity mix.
That's fascinating. And in a country of what you said, peak demand of about 12 gigawatts, right? That's
Yes,
that's
yes.
clearly that's clearly impressive.
Uh-huh.
So what factors do you believe have driven this unprecedented level of renewable integration in the power system?
Yeah, that's a great question. And you'll probably hear different answers depending on who you ask.
I'm
But
sure.
here's my take. So I think first, it's the most obvious one is the economics. About a decade ago, the cost of wind and solar PV became competitive with non-renewable sources like coal and natural gas. And this shift happened around the same time we started seeing investments in wind and solar in Chile. And this is especially relevant for Chile because we import all of our fossil fuels, so our
Mm.
prices are directly tied to international markets. But as you may know, that's not necessarily the case for other Latin American countries that produce some of their own fossil fuels and may have
Hmm.
lower uh, or subsidized prices for fossil fuels.
Yeah.
Then another factor is the abundance and quality of renewable resources. Chile has exceptional resources, with the northern part of the country receiving the highest solar radiation on the planet. And we also have areas with strong and diverse wind resources. Hydropower has long been a key part of our energy mix. Um, then another factor is the preferences of large customers, especially
Hmm.
mining companies. So mining companies consume about a third of Chile's annual electricity, and we're among the first to demand corporate renewable PPAs. That definitely was a push for renewables. Then we have the long-term contracts for retail customers that have also been quite important. And so Chile organizes these centralized auctions that are end up with contracts between generation and distribution companies. These are CFDs that have fixed prices in US dollars and terms of up to 20 years.
Mm-hmm.
And this setup gives developers predictable cash flows, attracting investors looking for steady returns. And then you also have renewable environmental policies. Chile has a renewable portfolio standard that started in 2010. But the market has consistently delivered more than double the annual
Mm-hmm.
renewable requirement. The latest requirement actually is 20% of non-conventional renewable energy by 2025. There's also the carbon price. It's $5 per ton, though it's not directly considered in real-time dispatch or electricity pricing. And Chile is also known for being a country with stable rules, which of course makes it easier to attract investors.
Fantastic. And one of the things, so you talked a little bit about kind of policies and kind of instruments that have been used in the transition, including CFDs, which are obviously probably widely regarded as the best way of
Mhm.
providing the revenue certainty needed for some of these investments. Um, one other thing that's relevant in Chile's kind of power sector is the coal phase out program.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about kind of that program and how it fits within the country's broader kind of decarbonization goals?
Yeah. So Chile's coal phase out program, it's a voluntary but binding agreement that was signed in 2019 between generation companies and the state of Chile. Um, the agreement is divided into two stages. The first stage, companies committed to retiring or converting nearly 30% of the coal units capacity by 2024. That's been already achieved. And the second stage aims for the retirement or conversion of all remaining units by 2040. And what makes this agreement notable is that it doesn't come with any direct fiscal cost to the country,
Hmm.
like similar policies in other places like Germany's, like Germany, sorry, companies in Chile didn't receive any compensation for agreeing to the phase out. And and of course this has had a huge impact on CO2 emissions of the power sector, as you would expect. CO2 emissions are coming down quite rapidly as a result of all this transformation. Actually, in the last 2 years, the annual CO2 emissions of the power sector have gone down by nearly 40%. And in fact, there is no other economic sector of the country showing such progress in CO2 emission reductions. We also recently published an infographic. Maybe you saw it on LinkedIn that shows trends in emission factors for power systems in different regions. And what we see is that a decade ago, the CO2 intensity of the Chilean power system was close to the world average. That's 0.54 tons of CO2 per megawatt hour. But today, that CO2 intensity has come down to less than half of that number.
Fantastic. That's the renewables kind of doing the
Yeah,
work.
exactly.
For our listeners that haven't seen it, if it, Generadoras publishes one of the nicest kind of looking infographics and more informative. So if you want a quick snapshot of what the Chilean system looks like, it's a great way of understanding what's going on. So you talked so just a little bit more
Mm.
on this topic. So you talked about conversion, and then there's some interesting kind of discussions around, the conversion of some of the existing thermal plants, from everything into it, from kind of thermal storage to kind of other technologies. How do you see that evolving? Is that something that you think will happen economically? Do you think that's something that needs kind of support in terms of providing kind of carbon free, but kind of more stable kind of sources of
Hmm.
generation in the system?
Yeah. So we see some companies are starting to to move into the conversion of some of their units. They're not betting on the same strategy as you mentioned. So, for example, the retirement of coal units is raising concerns about, for example, voltage stability and system
Mhm.
inertia, particularly in regions where wind and solar generators are connected. And to address this, the system operator recently ran an auction this year as part of the ancillary services market, to procure synchronous condensers,
Mhm.
either as new or standalone devices, or through the conversion of generators that are close to retirement. So that's one way to sort of repurpose this coal units that are retiring. Um, so I think yeah, there are signals in the market. So there are probably incentives for power plants that can provide us a steady output throughout the
Mhm.
year. What's probably missing is signals for companies to get paid for providing services such as flexibility, and there's probably something to work on that front.
Yeah, no, completely agree. I mean, it's interesting, the ancillary services markets in Chile, and I won't go into the details. It's
Mm,
something we will look in a lot of detail in our work at Aurora. But they typically represent a very small portion of revenues for assets like batteries, where in other countries the majority of revenues for batteries come from ancillary services, and that's partly a function of the design of
yes.
this market. So definitely something kind of worth exploring,
Mhm.
and we may touch a little bit on that later on. But you mentioned kind of system operability effectively, and I think one of the most interesting and challenging aspects of the Chilean market is its geography. And you touched on this before. It's the longest and narrowest country in the world, and so often, obviously, that creates kind of challenging operability issues. So, you know, with that in mind, so we've talked about the massive integration of renewables kind of recently, the coal phase out, operability challenges, in addition to the fact that you have kind of where the resources are not necessarily where all of the demand is. So do you see any signs of stress as
Mhm.
the energy transition kind of starts to take kind of a more accelerated pace, I would say, especially considering the geographical challenges of the country?
Yeah. So there are signs of stress, or to put a positive spin on it, areas where there are opportunities for regulatory
Hmm.
improvement, market design tweaks, or I don't know, new business ventures, whatever you want to call it. So, for instance, um, over the last uh, 5 years, we've seen a substantial increase in solar and wind curtailment. And to give you an idea, curtailment levels were at just 2% back in 2019. These are renewable curtailments for wind and solar. But last year, that number had jumped to 10%. And during the first half of this year, curtailment has already hit 14%. So these numbers are increasing.
And that's on average,
Then,
obviously. Some
yeah.
projects are
Oh,
impacted significantly more than that.
absolutely. Yeah. That's the average for the whole year or
Yeah.
the first 6 months of this year. Then, as you mentioned, transmission congestion has also become an issue. And that's because most of the solar generation is concentrated in the northern regions near the desert, but a large fraction of the demand is located in the middle of the country near Santiago. Congestion also gets worse in dry years since most
Mm.
of Chile's hydropower comes from the southern regions. That flips the power flows. That problem was worsened by the rise of fossil fuel prices due to the pandemic and the Ukraine war. Um, we're also seeing more variability in spot prices. So during solar hours, prices can drop to very low levels or even zero and then spike in the evening. This is especially noticeable in areas rich in renewables with lower operating costs. And that's something you will expect in a market with nodal pricing, of course.
Hmm.
Um, Zero prices aren't entirely new to the Chilean power system. And I say this because back in the 80s and 90s, it was common to see zero prices for weeks in a row during rainy years. Chile's always been a hydro system, same in Brazil. And what I just said, the retirement of coal units is also creating some challenges on voltage stability and inertia.
That's kind of fascinating. One of the other topics, and we haven't really touched on this, but I find this one of the more interesting discussions happening in Chile now, and I think will continue to happen over the next kind of few years. It's the transition from a cost-based to a bid-based system. So you mentioned this briefly before, but Chile is a cost-based kind of market, so it's based on audited costs, and that's what's used to dispatch kind of assets in the market. Now, there's been a lot of work already done on this topic, on the benefits of a kind of transition to a bid-based system. And I know, Francisco, that you've actually published on this topic. So I'd love to get your views as to kind of what you think are the benefits of a bid-based versus cost-based system. What are some of the drawbacks, of course, because obviously there would be some drawbacks, and particularly what that journey might look like for Chile.
Yeah, good catch. So we wrote that paper after I came back to Chile in 2015, and it was because I didn't really understand how the Chilean electricity market worked. And that's because all I had learned about electricity markets in the US was about US and European markets. So it
Bid-based all
was,
the way.
yeah, yeah. So it was kind of a reaction to that. So let me start with a little bit of history. So the Chilean market design of the 80s was used as a reference to reform power sectors in other countries, including some in the US. But it turns out that we have learned a lot about the economics of electricity markets in the last 4 decades. So when I came back in 2015, hardly anyone was talking about this topic, about updating our market design. But as you said, today there are probably about a dozen reports with recommendations on what needs to be adjusted in the market. The Coordinador recently commissioned a report on that, the National Energy Commission as well. And if you look at all of these reports, including some of my own papers, they all offer very, very similar recommendations. And before talking about the bid-based market, the main message of all of these reports is that Chile doesn't need a foundational overhaul. So what the Chilean market needs is to implement reforms that enhance what we already have, basically. And let's talk a little bit about the journey now, because maybe the final destination is the full-blown bid-based market. But to get there, we need to improve many other aspects of the market along the way. So let's start with some of the first reforms that need to be performed. So the first one is to increase the granularity of spot prices. Today, prices are computed every hour, but the coordinator is already making progress on these fronts. The pricing interval was just dropped from hours to 15 minutes this year. Then we're going to need to start computing prices using dispatch software instead of merit order curves as done today. Then we're going to implement some form of a multi-settlement system. Today we only have a real-time market. Maybe the first step is going to be to implement a day-ahead market and then move to intraday markets. Once we do that, we're going to need to start optimizing energy and reserves every time the dispatch software is rerun. And all of these measures that I'm mentioning are point at giving the right signals to remunerate flexibility efficiently and to allocate risks efficiently as well among market participants. With regards to the transition to a bid-based market, so with the bid-based market, it's going to be much easier to integrate and manage a power system with lots of resources that don't have direct fuel costs. That's the whole point. So, and what I mean by that, for example, renewables, plus storage or standalone storage, demand-side resources. We still don't have demand-side resources here. And I challenge someone that believe that could be added to a cost-based market. So what's an administrative estimate for a demand side bid? What are you going to audit there? So a bid-based market is mostly about the way the system operator is going to be able to collect information from all market participants. So we've been estimating the opportunity cost of water in hydro plants for decades, and that's a reasonable approximation for a simple system with a few hydro plants. But once the system gets too complex, it becomes really hard to do it that correctly, and that's one of the reasons most of these reports are suggesting the transition to a bid-based market. And there are also some other recommendations, such as incorporating, for example, instruments to hedge congestion risks, such as FDRs. So what I say is that some of these reforms are already or the system operator is already making progress in some of these lines. But then there are other reforms that will require changing the law, and that can take longer since it means going through Congress.
So what do you think that timeline looks like? And I know, you don't have a crystal ball and neither do
Mhm.
we, but presumably we're talking, 4 or 5 years at the earliest,
Yeah.
probably even longer than that in some ways. Is that a fair assessment?
I think so. Yeah. So let me think. Yeah, one of the latest reports commissioned by the National Energy
Hmm.
Commission, yeah, talks about 2 or 3 phases, and that maybe we can get there by 2030, something like that. Yeah. So 6 years, 7 years.
And I guess, perhaps a kind of question, and I think I know the answer to this, but it'd be great for our audiences to understand this a bit better. So, you've talked about kind of financial transmission rights. You've talked about kind of bid-based, kind of how that interacts with kind of storage, particularly, or hybrid kind of assets. Um, a lot of these things have been talked about in other markets for a while, and you yourself kind of talked about this in 2015, I guess. So what do you think are some of the key drivers for, I guess, the change in the conversation in Chile now?
Hmm.
Why is this being looked at now, and not kind of a couple of years ago, I guess?
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great question. Um, so from a practical standpoint, um, simplifications that were once sufficient or accurate enough are becoming less so as we integrate more renewables, like wind and solar. So take, I don't know, time granularity, for instance. In the past, when power systems didn't have the levels of variability we see today with high levels of wind and solar, um, competing prices on an hourly basis was maybe accurate enough, but that's no longer the case. Systems with significant wind and solar penetration, a lot can happen within an hour. So that's one thing. And then the second reason, I think it's more relating to the local context. So if you look at markets such as PJM or California in the US, or European markets, UK, Germany, if you look at the annual electricity demand in terawatt hours, that demand has remained relatively flat or even decreased over the last 20 years. But if you look at countries like Chile and Brazil, those systems have experienced significant increases in annual electricity demand, and which is typical for emerging economies. So in Chile, for example, the annual demand for electricity has increased by 4x over the last 25 years. And I think this reflects a fundamental difference in priorities, of course. So while more developed markets in the US and Europe um, have focused on refining and sophisticating their short-term market designs, policymakers and regulators in Chile and Brazil have been primarily concerned with long-term signals. So that's ensuring that the infrastructure keeps pace with the country's rapid demand growth. And I think that's why countries such as Chile or Brazil were among the first to implement centralized markets for long-term contracts.
Absolutely. And to build on what you said, and probably stating a bit of an obvious point, like if you have a country with kind of growing demand, where the hydro and a fleet that used to be kind of one of the main sources of energy doesn't change. And it's everyone knows it's hard to add additional hydro to a system for a number of reasons. If you have the thermal fleet with kind of high ambitions to decommission that, then obviously the system becomes more and more renewable based, and that just exacerbates all of these challenges that you're highlighting, which obviously kind of means that this needs to be thought through again. And you mentioned the two settlement system, and I think most people in Europe are used to thinking about this and the risk that as a generator you take for not forecasting, I guess, your energy deliveries in the correct way. And in Chile, that's not necessarily the case. Like, your day ahead, I guess, commitment to some degree, it's not binding, right? So
Yeah.
so the risk of generators not delivering what they said they would doesn't fall on generators. And obviously that's a socialized cost, which also needs to be looked at. So, Francisco, you touched a little bit on this in terms of kind of the energy transition, and storage is a topic that Aurora loves to talk about, and we focus a lot of our work on this kind of asset class. And we think this will be a major kind of development in Chile. The curve in Chile it's crazy in basically all of the northern regions of the country. So just to focus a little bit on storage, are there any of these challenges that you've mentioned particularly affecting, I guess, the development of energy storage in the Chilean market? And what are some of the things that you think need to happen to really reach the potential of
Yeah.
storage in Chile?
Yeah. Um, so I will say that these challenges are still not affecting the integration of energy storage, but they probably will once we start integrated more devices into the system, especially batteries. So as of July 2024, we have close to 2 gigawatts of batteries either already in operation, in testing, or under construction. You can look at that into you can look at our monthly report for those numbers. And what's driving this growth in energy storage are factors like the ones you mentioned. For example, there's obviously the opportunity to arbitrage the price differences between the day and the evening. Then there is a renewable curtailment. So batteries that are co-located with renewable projects can store excess energy and boost the capacity factor of these projects. And then another big driver is a new capacity accreditation rule that was introduced this year. And this rule gives storage devices a capacity credit of nearly 100% of their nameplate capacity if they can store energy for 4 hours or more. And this rule will be in place for a decade. So it's providing strong incentive for investment now. But going forward, the market might need some adjustments to accommodate storage. So, for example, we know that batteries can be very, very effective at providing services like frequency control, as we've seen in places like Australia. But the challenge is that in Chile, unlike the energy market, in the ancillary services market, there's no way for batteries or generators to make inframarginal rents, basically. So there is less motivation to participate in these markets. And then a bigger challenge might come in the near future once all these batteries come online and start participating in the wholesale market. What we already talked about, the cost-based market, was not really built to handle a large number of energy storage units. And this administrative process is going to get more and more complex. But that said, things aren't always rosy elsewhere. I just got back from a conference in Seattle, and I saw a presentation and spoke to people from the California ISO. We talk about the challenges of making centralized estimates of opportunity costs for batteries. Because for the record, California has a bid-based market, of course, but the ISO still computes default energy bids, devs for all resources. And it seems like even the California ISO doesn't have a clear solution for that yet. So I guess that's what happens when you're one of the first in the world to massively integrate a new technology, and you don't have anyone else to learn from.
Yeah, no, and again, the kind of Chile knows how how this looks like, I guess, and in being a kind of leader in some of this kind of initiatives, which actually brings me to I think what it's a good way to kind of wrap up the conversation, which is, you know, there's clearly a lot of things that need to happen in the Chile kind of system as it adapts to kind of a more renewable kind of system as we discussed. But do you think there are any lessons from the Chile experience that could benefit other countries as they navigate the energy transition, particularly those that are not as advanced as Chile is?
Yeah. So, as Vaclav Smil puts it, there is nothing new about energy transitions. We humans have done it before, but this transition is different because of the speed and scale that is needed to meet climate targets. So, uh, most of the investments in clean energy today involve technologies with high capital costs, but very low operating costs. So we're basically left with two ways to reduce the overall cost of this transition. One is to keep driving innovation, which has already brought down the cost of solar batteries to surprisingly low levels, and they might keep going down. But there's only a handful of countries that are, participating in this innovation race. And the other alternative is to focus on keeping the cost of capital as low as possible. And it's in this second area where I think other countries could really learn from Chile experience with auctions for long-term contracts. And the reason, and I mentioned this because um, the challenge that Chile and Brazil tried to address with these auctions in the early 2000s was encouraging investments to keep up with demand. And that's essentially the same challenge the world faces now with accelerating the energy transition. That is, deploying large amounts of capital in a relatively short time frame. And we see lots of experts today talking about the need to think about long-term market design. So some frame it as mechanisms to reduce transaction costs. Others describe these auctions as ways of completing the market with enough instruments to hedge risks. I think I've also heard some refer to these instruments as central procurement structures. Whatever name we put on them, we know this organized market, long-term markets are one way to keep the cost of capital down by providing investors with some levels of revenue certainty. But we know that over the long run, there is no substitute for things like a predictable business environment, strong institutions, and control inflation, for example. And this is especially crucial for developing countries where the cost of capital can be more than twice as high as in the developed world. So keeping costs low is key to making progress in transforming power systems around the world. And low electricity costs are also going to give people incentives to switch to electric options for things like heating and transport, which are the next steps in the energy transition.
Absolutely. And whatever electrification can be done in industry and kind of mining and etc. will also come
Mhm.
from only when you have kind of low prices to support that. And from a purely selfish perspective, I guess, as someone that kind of goes into new markets and builds kind of power market models to assess kind of revenue potential over time, I will double down and say that the transparency of data in Chile is one of those things that I think really allows people to understand kind of what the system looks like, how kind of the operator looks at kind of the dispatch of the system, how the regulator looks at kind of cost when thinking about cost. And it is truly impressive to see just how much data transparency, regulatory transparency, information about pipelines, things that we don't have in Europe. Is there in
Wow.
Chile, and it does actually make a big difference when you're trying to understand the risk and opportunities for investment, right? So back to your point, I know there isn't a kind of variable that captures kind of data availability in the CAPM model. But people look at this, and it's one of those factors that really does give you confidence when investing in a market. Francisco, we probably should end there. This has been an incredibly insightful conversation. Thank you so very much for joining us again today. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on the podcast and frankly learning from your extensive experience on this.
Thank you so much for the invitation. It was a pleasure.
That was Ana Barillas, Aurora's Managing Director for Iberia and Latin America, talking to Francisco Muñoz, Director of Research at Generadoras de Chile. Thanks for listening to Energy Unplugged. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to follow or subscribe to the podcast via whatever platform you use.